Okay, so we're here in an interview in the frame of the COES conference, and we're with Professor Steffen from Humboldt University, Berlin. Thank you very much for agreeing to come all the way down to Chile just for a couple of days.
It's a pleasure.
And for this interview, and we're also with Raimundo Frei from UNDP, who we both prepared the questions for the interview. And we just had the talk from Professor Mao here at the conference. And it was mostly about his last book from last year, Das metrische Wir, which is the metric we, something, that's the translation. And want to, we hear already the main arguments of the book, but we're going to take advantage of this opportunity to have some more specific questions about what you wrote there. And also about, we're going to start with your previous work. So thank you very much again. I'm going to start with the first question, which is, so in what you have been doing the last years, I think it's possible to observe a transition from perspective focused on the welfare state and country comparisons toward the consideration of topics such as the middle class and also lately more the individual in Das metrische Wir. And the question is would you say that there is a transition in your research agenda from a more macro perspective towards the inclusion of individuals and groups in sociological analysis?
Yeah, I know from the outside it might look like this, and I have now at Humboldt University a chair for macro sociology. So basically I'm a little bit tagged to that kind of perspective, but okay. I'm not a big fan of the division between macro and micro. I think it is a little bit outdated. All micro sociologists now also are interested in institutional context. So if they do comparative work, of course they talk about different regime, think about life course or demographic behavior. And on the other hand, I think just doing macro sociology in terms of country level comparisons without looking at the effects on the individuals is also a little bit outdated. So most of the research I'm doing is shifting in between, and some of the research is explicitly macro level related. So both links matter, and if you think about multi-level research frames, then of course both are important. So maybe it's a temporary shift, but not a complete shift. But the individual always will play a role, as well as the social context they live in.
Okay, thank you. And coming back to your first book, this is 2003, The Moral Economy of the Welfare State, Britain and Germany Compared. There you claim, I quote here, a cost-benefit analysis alone cannot sufficiently explain how pro-welfare attitudes develop. Rather, we also need to understand how the institutional arrangements of the welfare state incorporate norms and values. So norms and values are then related in the book to the concept of reciprocity, which is beyond self-interest. So the question is, how would you evaluate the consideration of reciprocity notions of welfare state policy in welfare state policy designs nowadays? Is it an important concept in the policy design, or maybe has shifted away to give place to another concepts?
I mean, the point of departure when I started that kind of research was, of course, a kind of dissatisfaction with this strong duality between self-interest driven attitudes on the one hand and other regarding or altruistic types of attitudes, sometimes related to morality or values. And so when you look more closely at the issue, why do people support the welfare state, then you see that there's always reciprocity involved. Even in social assistance schemes which cater for the lower classes or where you have a very strong type of income-related eligibility, people expect something in return. Not in equal terms, but good faith efforts, the willingness to re-enter the labor market is kind of appropriate behavior, and that always played a role in the welfare state. Of course, the notion of reciprocity shifts over time, and it also is different whether you look at the health sector, the labor market, or the pension issue. I think, we have now the turn to the social investment state. There's a different notion of reciprocity. That is, we invest now, so we are now willing to support in certain areas of social policy, certain specific groups, be it educational groups or be it a training measure, with the expectation that there will be a payoff later.
In the future.
So I think the notion of reciprocity in terms of getting something back out of the money you have invested in specific groups has been emphasized in this regard. And so if you think about groups who cannot give back, so elderly or handicapped people, so they fall out of the frame of the social investment state. And also in the labor market, I think it's quite obvious that giving and taking has been related more closely. So there's a strong contractual notion now in the active labor market policy where people only get conditional benefits. And the types of conditions which are put into these kind of welfare state architectures, they differ largely, but mostly is that they should be self-sustaining, that they should not live on the dole, that they should stand on their own feet. And all help which is given is basically conditional, that people really make strong efforts to re-enter the labor market, regardless of whether they get less payment, regardless of whether it's below their skill level and so on. And this has been, I think, enforced by the new labor market policies and also the changes in the welfare state structure. So I would say reciprocity plays a role, but the notion of reciprocity has shifted a little bit, and it's more a kind of type of balanced reciprocity, where people are less universal, less generous, also are less willing to pool larger groups of very different risks and lump them together.
Yeah, it's a kind of enforced reciprocity or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. So you want to know exactly in advance what will be a return and when. And if this contract is not fulfilled, then you have, from a point of view of a policymaker, every reason to lower the benefit level or even to deny access to the welfare state. And so in former times you had also more, let's say, unconditional forms of social assistance in many European countries, where people were not so closely monitored in terms of their actual behavior, in terms of their activities to get training or to re-enter work. And so there's a tighter and a tighter form of treatment, and the expectations towards the unemployed people have been, I think, intensified.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I want to move now to the topic of meritocracy, since you were also, interested in this area, and you had a seminar last year at Humbold University when I was lucky to be there. And Michael Young, The Rise of Meritocracy, the famous book, here ironically says that we all want equality of opportunity and meritocracy, but except for our offspring, our sons and daughters. So for them, we want always the best at any cost. So you point into this direction in your book, Inequality Marketization and the Majority Class, particularly in chapter 7, where you say that middle classes seek to ensure advantages through education. So my question is, to what extent are the norms of intrafamilial reciprocity fighting against equality of opportunity and meritocracy?
Yeah, there's an inherent tension, because I think for parents, of course, they have the right, and it's also highly justified and also appropriate to transfer certain human capital and certain forms of knowledge to your children. And I think the society also needs that. If there would be no intergenerational transfer of competencies and education, and you would leave everything to the school system or the state training system, then I think the society would fail. So you need parents to raise kids, and the only option that you could have to basically to disentangle parents and kids is to take out the kids right after they were born, and of course this is socially not acceptable. And of course, if you think about meritocracy, there are two lines or two connections, and the first is between parents or family background and educational attainment or educational competence, and the second one is between educational attainment and labor market positions and rewards. And we often tend to look at the second one, and for the first we are a little bit more hesitant.
Yeah.
But what we know, of course, is from many studies, and the PISA study is the core study here, is that the competences and the educational attainment is somehow related to parental background.
Yeah.
So that very often the competences, they are normally distributed, whereas the educational attainment is highly attached to the parental background.
Yeah.
And to disentangle that would be already a step forward. And I think in this regard, meritocracy remains somehow an ideal conception, but it can never be fully realized. Yeah. But it can be approximately, and it can basically encourage us to ask specific type of questions. And the problem would be if you would measure, I mean, this is also part of Michael Young's book, which is critical of the concept of meritocracy. Yeah. If you would start to measure the intelligence of people at a very early age and then distribute educational opportunities according to that kind of distribution, because some investments from the side of the state may make more sense than others. And this is of course very problematic, because your genes and your intelligence level are not so predictive of your final achievements, and cannot predict individual performance. They can give you an overall statistical correlation, but not much more. So the basic emphasis should be on, and if you take roles as a point of departure, it would also make more sense to lift those at the lower level, to give them more educational opportunity so that they can flourish and develop very well. Whereas at the higher level, you see that there's a lot of transfer of educational capital is happening, but also financial support for so-called enrichment activities, be it afternoon schooling activities and hobbies. And most studies show that the gap has been growing over time. The private investment for education, the lower classes, the middle and the upper classes, and so the lower classes really fall behind. They stagnate at a relatively low level, and so to offer more opportunities is of course to broaden the support and to intensify the support for the lower classes.
Yeah, definitely. This question is also about meritocracy, and more for a disciplinary perspective. So this concept is mentioned repeatedly in sociological literature, mainly sociology of education, also studies of social mobility. But my impression is that it is always used in a kind of instrumental fashion, so in terms of an argument to explain something else, but meritocracy itself has barely been tackled in depth from sociology. There's some exceptions, but I think there's not too many. So would you say that meritocracy is a valuable concept in sociological literature nowadays?
The more you think about meritocracy, the more complicated it gets. So it's really a very delicate and difficult issue, and I think it's still a valuable concept because it's a leading concept for the justification of inequality in modern societies. Though of course it's very often undercut, and there are many other aspects which play a role. But for justifying the inequality order, it still plays a major role, and it's highly accepted by the people. So people think that talent, efforts and skills should be rewarded. We have done an own study about the understanding and the reasoning about meritocracy in different countries, and what we found there is that on the item, so if you use quantitative surveys, then things look very similar because you use always the same items in cross-national research. But if you look more closely in the understanding of reciprocity, then you find quite striking and interesting differences. So the German context is very much related to the, let's say, the industrial skilled labor model. So people want to have a connection between education, skill, and rewards or social positions, whereas the Anglo-Saxon model is very much a market success-based type of meritocracy. So if you risk something, if you invest something, and you finally win or gain something, then it is justified for that reason. So education and skill does not matter that much. And in the Scandinavian case we looked at, you found that people think about reciprocity also in terms of common good, in terms of common good. So it is not only necessary to be active and to be hardworking and to have skill, but also the question whether this is to the benefit of a society should matter for the rewards you receive. And so this opens up a very huge field where you can say, so reciprocity tells us little and tells us quite a lot at the same time. For example, reciprocity is extremely silent about the level of rewards you should get. Only that they should be differentiated, but whether a top manager should get 20 times as much as the average worker or 100 times, this cannot be derived from the concept of reciprocity. So to some extent it remains somehow blind with regard to real inequality structures, but on the other hand I think it is still, as a normative principle, has still some validity because it's so well entrenched in society, and it is a central norm for most Western countries.
Yeah, but I think we need more research from sociology, because I think there are not too many people doing, exactly seeing the concept as the core of the research agenda. So
I agree with you. Partly it's done implicitly it's done in educational research. But in other research on inequality attitudes, but also mobility studies, I think there is still something to be done, and it's valuable to pursue that a little bit more.
So I'm going to hand in the microphone to Raimundo.
So, Professor Mal, thank you very much again to stay with us in this conference. I would like to turn on the new book. I will start with a more general question. Over the last 3 years, some sociological works have been published in Germany which offer new comprehensive readings of modern times. I'm referring to Helmut Rosa Resonanz, Andreas Bregby's Die Gesellschaft der Singularitäten, and yours, also published in Sarkam, Das metrische Wir. According to you, why do this macro diagnostic of modern times emerge from German sociology? And I would also like to ask, are some social conditions which explain this intellectual moment, or is there a generation momentum, given the fact that the three of you were born around 1968, or just a continuum, in the sense that along with other publications of intellectual German tradition which offers time to time this kind of works?
I think, for quite some time sociology was relatively silent also in the public German debate. I don't know whether it shifts now, but some of the works, Hartmut Rosa and Reckwitz, they have received quite some attention because I think there's a lack of knowledge of orientation. So guiding knowledge, how to interpret what is going on, and you all know that sociology is now also, like most other disciplines, a highly specialized field of work, and so you find very detailed analysis about the determinants of the third child of high-skilled or women, and so it's often very highly specific, and I think there's a lack of So aggregation of knowledge and also a lack of having a good interpretative level. So why in Germany? I think, I mean, of course, there was always a strong theoretical tradition in Germany. I'm not part of this tradition, but of course, you are not immune to influence, to be influenced also by others. And Rosa and Reckwitz, they are of course less empirical than I am, so I'm not working on a theory of modernity or something like that. I'm just trying to figure out specific types of problems and related perspectives where I think sociology has something to say. And when I went into the field of quantification, my main interest was the object of observation. So what is happening to a society that uses numbers for self-description, self-understanding and self-rationalization? How does it affect inequality? And this was my main angle to look at that type of issues. There is an earlier generation, of course. Ulrich Beck is maybe the most prominent name, but also others, Wolfgang Streeck, and so who have always written books which have received quite some attention beyond the narrow field of sociology, and they are also acting as public intellectuals in the German context. So I think these are of course maybe not leading models, but at least people where you can learn how to do that and how to interact with the public. I think in the British and in the French society you have these figures too, maybe a little bit less in the US context of sociology. But in most other European countries, I see a very strong empirical turn. In Scandinavian countries, but also Netherlands and some other countries, where people are expert in their specific field and do not write bigger narratives of transformation of modern societies. It remains to be seen whether this is still a genre that will survive in the long run. Maybe younger people do not read books anymore, and this has. But till now, I mean, the books you mentioned were quite successful products of sociology, and I think it's very important to have still a public sociology and most other disciplines. I mean, also in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, think about the economists, and so they are all able to write popular books to a broader audience, and to make their topics accessible to the interested lay person, and not just to a smaller group of specialists.
Great. Now, referring to your last book, in your last book you affirm, if I understood well, I read the German version. The name of the English version will be?
The Metric Society, on the quantification of the social.
Okay, that you affirm that the extensive quantification of social reality prompted by new technological devices, along with the process of becoming a society of evaluating and comparing individuals, and the universalization of competition has brought about a new regime of inequality. Just talk about in your last conference here, but can you describe for this content, for the interview, of what consists this new regime?
I mean, my observation is that as we make more and more use of numbers or numerical value in describing social status of individuals, be it the credit score, the health score. The Los Angeles police uses threat scores. In courts, people use now algorithms to decide on certain crimes and how long a person should stay in prison. You have that in the whole insurance sector, also in the welfare state. Some of the European countries are now using algorithms to establish eligibility or the exclusion from welfare benefits. And so when I started to write the books, then I thought, oh, these are phenomena which are happening everywhere. So you see ranking of universities, measurement in science, so impact and age index. You see that in the self-quantification movement. You see that in all the rating business, in the new platform economy, which could not survive without a 5 stars system, be it eBay or even the darknet. You have these kind of reputation scores. And also professions are now scored, teachers, professors, doctors. And then I thought, these different single phenomena, they have been described in different works, but maybe they are part of one syndrome. So they simply belong together. They are driven by digitization, so the availability and easy to get data production on the one hand, and the second is of course the economization of society, where you basically transfer principles which exist at the market in areas which are quite distant from the market. But if you don't have prices, what do? You need data, you need information for comparing, for making things competitive, for establishing quasi markets. And to have this kind of panorama and to understand that this is not just something which measures society, but something that where society is reformatted and reorganized by the use of data, where we get a different understanding of the status of a person or specific activities with then specific links to life chances of individuals, be it at the labor market, at the partnership market, at the educational market or the housing market. And my prediction would be that data will matter more and more for allocating or distributing life chances for individuals.
Okay. I mean, we have already discussed in the conference, like it sounds like a little too much negative, but there are some aspects, like I don't know if positive is the word, but there are some positive aspects that we observe in the book. I am referring in particular to the loss of power of certain authorities or certain professions by the opportunity to evaluate them. Examples is the doctors that you, after the treatment, you can assess them with our own values. This doesn't happen in Chile, but in the book say that it happens in other parts. But probably it could be a start. We are going to start in Chile to evaluate them. But taking these examples of others, can we observe some democratizing aspects within this new social configuration of metrics and quantification?
I mean, there are some, of course, positive aspects. I think information and transparency is now a very good, considered as a very good thing. But there's also a tyranny of transparency. So if everything can be measured and counted and monitored, then of course you are not free to behave in an unobserved way. So if you do sports or certain types of activities, your drinking habits or your driving routines, styles, if everything is basically observed and measured, then it has an impact to the way you behave. But still, I think, I mean, in particular, the power of professions is largely undermined by mass ratings, by user-generated contents. Also think about Airbnb or different websites, TripAdvisor and so on, which orders the world. So 95% of the bookings then go to the first 10 in the list, and these are those who have 4.8 or 5 stars. So it's very important for the establishment and the organization of a market. So if you you have a shop or you have a restaurant in a small town where a lot of tourists come, and you are basically have just a 3-star rating, then of course you run into difficulties. So it's a very strong competition, and it forces the services to somehow to improve and to do better. But at the same time, we know that many of these ratings are manipulated, So business, of course, they have to do that by themselves. And we also know, for example, rating of doctors or professors, that they are not objective rating in a sense of a professional standard. So if you rate a doctor, what do? Whether the person is friendly, whether you find a parking place in front of the house, whether the nurse at the desk has given you a good or an early appointment time. So you do not rate the, let's say, the medical profession in a narrow sense, the medical competences, but something else. But you take it as a rating of professional competencies. And the same, of course, if you rate teacher or professors, we all know that professors are better rated if they reaffirm the opinion students already have. So if you say what they want to hear, then they rate you better. But we know at the same time that they learn more when you challenge and question their opinion. So I'm not saying that it's bad. It can be emancipatory. It can be very positive to undermine or undercut the power of professionals. But at the same time, it raises some other problems. And I think we have to be aware when we use these kind of measurements and numbers that it's not a better world for a worse world which we are replacing. We are just replacing one world for the other.
Right. Okay. This is a very interesting point about the feelings which create these numbers and new data. It is said that people look for security and rational control using quantitative data. Taking the word of Gary Wolf that you quote in your book, numbers make problems less resonant emotionally, but more tractable intellectually. And however, you show that the daily life use of quantitative data generates more insecurity and anxious feelings because of permanent competition with ourselves and with other people. I would like to connect this point with your book about middle classes. I wonder if those feelings of insecurity and anxiety are not the same experience by the wide sector of European middle classes as you described in previous work. And I mean, are not a good extent of your description only experienced by middle classes?
It's predominantly, I think maybe a middle class issue, this kind of status insecurity. So what is middle class about? So you have enough resources and enough capital to invest and to better your position, to improve your position or to maintain your position, but you also have something to lose. If you're at the lower end of the social strata, you have nothing to invest, but also nothing to lose. And at the top end, maybe you can afford to ignore simply the regime of numbers because you can afford any health insurance you want. You are not observed while you are driving because you look for a better tariff. And so it could be that it's very much middle class related, but in a larger sense, so maybe 80 or 90% of the overall population. And the problem or the paradox of this kind of objectification of status via number. So you know exactly where you stand. Think about the metrics we use as researchers for knowing how often we are cited and what our age index is. We know that we stand, but at the same time we enter into a competitive mode which is ongoing. So you can never be sure that your status is safe somehow. You are not. You can always. There are people who perform better, and of course, this kind of competition. If you compare yourself, this is also a result from well-being research. If you compare yourself strongly with others, you are less satisfied and more status insecure. So it basically, you run into this kind of ongoing trap where you start to compare yourself. You use quantitative data in order to feel more safe and to get some status affirmation, but at the same time you are basically in an endless mode of of reactivating, reaffirming, and doing better in terms of your status. So it's a little bit an illusion that you can become more status secure and not. And of course, the data, it's a type of inescapability. All data which are collected over time can be relevant for your type of status, but also all new events can affect your status. So it's always a kind of, you are always in a standby modus, and you're at the risk of losing your status if you fail in some respect, if you do less than you have done before, if you live more unhealthy than you have done before. And so this is basically being monitored all the time, also implies that you can risk your status or you can lose your status all the time, because now they do not think about scientists, they do not simply say, so this person has not published enough. Even if you have done enough, then they can look. But in the last 2 years or the last 5 years, his publication record has really declined. Just look at the data, and then you can see, have a curve or different bars, and you can make that visible. And before, of course, once you had achieved a status, you could also rest a little bit. So you were freed from ongoing competition, and that makes a difference, I think.
Yeah, I remember the point that you said in ResearchGate, this academic portal that say boost yourself. Okay, thank you. Well, now we change.
Last question. Now I want to come back again to your book, Inequality Democratization, the Majority Class, which I like very much, I have to say. And here you point that to some extent the success of welfare states undermine their own basis of legitimacy. So in a context of widespread implementation of neoliberal policy, with the corresponding criticism, discomfort, and social mobilization, does this mean that a possible return to democratic social policies? Or is this rather that the position to neoliberal program is politically led by the populist right? How do you interpret the political direction that the United States and Europe have taken in recent years to this regard?
Well, of course, I mean, there was after the Second World War, was a big project of social democracy. And Ralph Dahndorf had written on that, so he said in the 80s he had a book chapter called The End of Social Democracy, because he said end of social democracy does not mean that the objective of social democracy disappear. It's simply they have been universalized. Yeah. Everyone is a social democrat somehow now, and all parties have adopted welfare-friendly agendas. And in the end, so the argument of my book is basically that there was, after the Second World War, an enormous gain in affluence and income, in particular to the benefit of the middle classes. So they were the great winners of the social democratization of Western societies. And this collective elevator, of course, leads to a situation where people sometimes think, I do not need redistribution anymore. I do not need an extensive welfare state for which I have to pay taxes. And one can clearly show that people who invest privately in education, for example, or people who are homeowners, or people who inherit money from their parents, that they become less redistribution friendly. There's a very strong relation between these two. So in the long run, so the richer the middle class gets, the less attached they are to the redistributive welfare of the welfare state. And now one can see also in surveys that they are more prone to support the investive welfare state because it fits more to their own educational ambitions. And of course there's still a lot of status insecurity, and we have the lower classes lagging behind and feeling discomforted by current processes. There is no project of the left for the time being, so no project which can appeal to the middle classes and to the lower classes at the same time. And of course we have the populist right upcoming, the lower classes sometimes for economic reasons, but sometimes also for reasons of of social chauvinism or anti-migration attitudes turn their back on social democracy, because one argument that is on the table is, of course, social democracy cannot be globalized. So as soon as a nation-state container opens up, you enter the issue of ethnic competition,
Right.
of migration, of an influx of foreigners, and then the people who have traditionally been the stronghold of social democracy, they might turn their back to social democracy as long as they stay positive to the opening of nation-state, to Europeanization, globalization, and migration issues. And you can see that clearly in the German context, that of course the Social Democratic Party is divided now internally into the more cosmopolitan part and into the more migration skeptical part. And the big winners of that shift of cleavage structures are of course the Green Party, who are clearly cosmopolitan, and they can unify or even attract people from social democracy and from Christian democracy who are more on the liberal side. And those who fear, let's say, global competition and migration, who turn to the right-wing populist party AfD. Look at East Germany. I mean, you have hardly any people with migrant background or foreigners living in East Germany, but the strongest anti-foreigner sentiments. And in the cities which are more diverse, like Berlin or Frankfurt and others, you have a lower level of anti-migration sentiment. So it's not mechanical.
Yeah.
It needs entrepreneurs. It needs a specific type of media coverage. So this is an important lesson to be learned from current research. And we also see that we have instances, for example, Spain is a country which has the highest influx of migrants before the migration crisis 2015. But if you look at the 10 years before 2005 to 2015, they had quite a large number of foreigners, also from other European countries, from Bulgaria and Romania, but also from Northern Africa. But they have a leftist populist movement, not a right-wing populist movement. So they turned into a totally different direction. And I think it would be interesting to look at the Spanish case to explain that and to understand how that could happen and in which way politicization took place. So there's still, I think, a lot of room for maneuver also for political actors to deal differently with the migration issue. What I can also only observe and maybe recommend from the German case is that things should be debated in a very open and transparent manner. So as soon as people or parts of the public believe that there's a kind of dominant normative discourse suppressing critical questions, suppressing also reporting on migrant crimes and so on, people get very suspicious. So they start to distrust the whole system, and the whole political discourse somehow shifts into a very right-wing direction. I think also in the German case some problems and mistakes have been made in the past, and one could do better. And most countries, they benefit from migration, but the benefits are unequally distributed in society. So lower groups, socioeconomic groups, lower skilled people, they face more competition. For them it's tougher, whereas for the highly skilled, they can also enjoy migration due to home services and other price levels and other issues. And so I think the country also needs to think about the lower classes and to compensate also for new forms of insecurity and also forms of competition which come about with a higher number of migrants. And this needs to be part of the political agenda.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate that you had time for this interview and for coming back to Chile. We hope to have you here again soon. So maybe presenting a new book, who knows? So thank you very much again.
Thank you.